Nina, where do EU member states stand on expanding sanctions on Russia at the moment?
Well, the problem is that the EU needs to be unanimous if they are to adopt further sanctions on Russia. But the EU, 28 member states of the EU, are very, very differently placed on what the best course of action is on Russia next. Now, their positions are based on economic reasons, historical factors and political factors as well. And interestingly, their positions don't necessarily correlate to the more dovish countries having stronger economic ties to Russia. So the Baltic states, for example, have very strong economic ties to Russia and yet are amongst the most dovish EU states because of obvious historical reasons.
It's a very long and protracted process, isn't it, getting the EU member states to agree on sanctions, unlike the US, who have come out stronger in recent days, saying that they will think about imposing wider sanctions. But without EU member states, do the US sanctions have teeth?
Well, obviously the EU sanctions would have more bite because when it comes to pure economics, the EU has much stronger links to the Russian economy than the US does. The EU does 15 times more trade with Russia than the US. Where we will maybe see movement today is further adoption of individual sanctions on individuals. However, broader economic sanctions on the Russian economy as a whole will be difficult to come by.
What are your hopes for these talks in Geneva? Because going into them, we're already talking about further sanctions being imposed, and they've not even completed these talks. And the talk's been pretty toxic going into it as well. The British Foreign Secretary William Hague saying in the last few days that action in eastern Ukraine has been planned by Russia and had all the appearances of a further gross, deliberate and premeditated violation of the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine.
Yes, and again, the UK has been one of the most hawkish countries, and the EU itself couldn't agree on Hague's statement. So the hopes for these talks are limited, actually. There isn't much hope that there could be broader economic sanctions adopted on Russia as a result of the talks today.
So what sanctions are on the table? Are they just economic sanctions?
Well, there are a variety of things that the EU could do. So, for instance, they could hit Russian imports from the EU, which they're dependent on. Russia is very dependent on the EU for imports of chemicals, medicines, machinery. So they could limit those exports to Russia. They could also freeze Russian firms and the Russian government out of US and EU capital markets. And although Russia has low external debt, it's still very dependent on the liquidity of these financial markets. So that could definitely squeeze the Russian economy. And as a last step, they could, of course, adopt broader economic sanctions on the energy sector as a whole. But given this considerable amount of pain on both sides, if the step were to be taken, I don't expect we'll be moving towards that at all.
Yeah, you talk about pain. What would be the fallout from a situation like that if that were to happen?
Well, the EU as a whole is 30% dependent on Russia for its oil and gas needs, so there would be significant pain, and basically the EU just doesn't have the infrastructure in place right now to move away from its dependency on Russian oil and gas. However, in the long term, as the EU is already moving away from Russia in terms of energy, as the infrastructure is put into place, it could hurt Russia more in the long term. But in the short term, the EU would suffer.
And in the main, are we thinking that sanctions will be effective, or Russia are just plotting their course and going along it anyway?
Well, there's a wide variety of opinion on how effective the sanctions would, but some would argue that the political fallout given with the Ukraine crisis is already a sanction on Russia itself. We've seen capital flight, we've seen the Russian ruble falling, so that because of the political uncertainty, Russia is basically sanctioning.
Okay, Nina Schick, very interesting to hear from you. Thank you very much for joining us here on